Welcome to the Real Health and Nutrition podcast, where we talk about everything nutrition related, from lots of things such as performance and nutrition, and that's what happens when you don't read off a script. My name is Max.
My name is Matthew Rigoni.
We're here to talk about the world of nutrition and everything in between. So today we're going to be a very interesting topic, and Matt's going to really dive in deep to today's topic, and I'm going to kind of sit in the background mostly. Matt, take us through what you want to talk about and how you're going to go about it today.
Absolutely. So we are dietitians. The purpose of today's cast is to discuss nutrition, cancer, the link between, and any diseases that are associated with weight gain. It's a bit of a loaded and very emotionally intense podcast, potentially, especially for some people who are familiar with those diseases and conditions. So if you are sensitive to those topics, please click away now. Other than that, Max, I think we're ready to jump in.
Cool. So I think for today, we haven't even discussed it, which is, I feel like it's better that way. I'm just going to kind of play devil's advocate. I think overall, you say your spiel. I'll say what I think. I'll say what I think in general, but then also I'll just have a bit of fun, play a bit of devil's advocate, say a few things that might be a little bit more controversial than what I should, and then you can kind of dismantle me as I go through. Does that sound okay?
Amazing. I love a good dismantlement.
Cool. Awesome. So start us off on your first points, and then we'll go through. I've obviously got a few things I'd like to say, but probably going to be more to the later end of the podcast. But yeah, take it away with that first point.
Sure thing. Okay, so to start off, I'd like to carry on from our previous topic. So we're talking about obesity, BMI, how that is potentially good or bad. No spoilers, you're going to have to watch the previous podcast to listen to that one. That's podcast number 5 from what I'm aware. It's a really good one, very much in depth in terms of the realities of BMI and if it's useful or not. I wanted to talk about nutrition and the influence on health regardless of BMI. I think we covered it a little bit, but nutrition and influence regardless of the total amount of fat and or adipose tissue that we have on our bodies. I think it's an extremely interesting topic, something I don't necessarily get spoken about much. It tends to be, from what I'm aware, an extremely difficult thing to accurately measure. When we're looking at epidemiological studies of countries and their health outcomes, majority of the time, the data that's acquired is through food frequency surveys. That is, I will send out a little sheet and it has a few different food groups or something similar, and you go, how many times do I eat apples or bananas or something per week? I'm a dietitian. I have absolutely no fucking clue. And if a normal person who isn't focused on their food 100% of the time, like we tend to be as dietitians or health professionals, they come along and do a food frequency questionnaire. As far as I'm concerned, that data is very vague and not exactly producing any high quality level of information that I can take a lot of information from.
I completely agree. And yeah, I think really well said. It's really hard one of the big difficulties of nutrition science is removing the person from the food, in that there's so many different things we can look at as to, this group of this population tends to get cancer a lot more than this population. Why is it? And then people always go to the food first, and they go, they're eating a lot more red meat, and it's like, okay, so it must be the red meat. And then that's where the thinking ends, it seems like, for some people. So I think, really good point in that separating those two is a very difficult thing to talk about.
I wish it was that easy. That would make my job so simple, because then I could just be blanket statements. If you do this, it will result in this statistically. It seems like our current state of nutrition awareness, while it's growing every year, the confounding variables seem to remain pretty consistent. Our ability to record and measure what people are eating is extremely difficult, even if you're, let's say, trained by a dietitian on how to accurately measure and record what you're eating. I find that a lot of my clients who I've let's say, supported to do this kind of measurement and tracking scenario in the past will potentially completely miss the entire day's worth of dietary intake from just a couple of things that haven't been really taken into account. So if I'm making a peanut butter sandwich, for example, I'll lick the peanut butter off the spoon. Or when I'm cooking my chicken breast in the pan, I'm not just cooking on a straight pan, I'm drizzling a little bit of oil. Or when I'm having my cereal in the morning, I'm not putting in that I'm having it with milk and which type of milk it is. There's a lot of factors that go at play.
You're not including how many times you're doing the taste test and you're, having your taste test in the batter of the cake. You have, 2-3 scoops of the batter of the cake, that you're making. So many things.
Absolutely.
Just add up over the course of the day and the week.
Without a doubt. And when we're extrapolating that data from a very small subset of population, realistically, we could only do that for 30 people financially without having to create some very interesting financial problems along the lines when we're doing that research. So
So what Matt's saying here, so I'll just quickly cut you off.
Go for it.
What Matt's saying is that a professional has done a specific, what's called a diet history on that person. So a professional, so it could be a dietitian or someone else that's highly trained. We as dietitians get trained very specifically on how to conduct these diet histories. So you've got to ask a specific set of questions in a very non-biased way, and you've got to really, really probe and prod. So when someone says, as what Matt was saying, what milk, what kind of milk? Like when someone says milk, sorry, you say, what kind of milk? How much milk? They go, I don't know, a drizzle. And you go, okay, well, would it fill up, an egg cup? Would it fill up a cup of this size or a cup of this size? Oh, I have a plate of vegetables. How big is the plate? There's so many different questions you've got to ask. What type of vegetables? There's a million different things. And then people go, oh, I don't know what milk it is. It just tastes good. I think it's from a cow. You go, oh, okay, so was it in a light blue or a dark blue or a pink color? And there's so many different things you can go around to figure out what people are eating, which unless you have, I know these things sound simple, but unless you're decently trained on how to actually get the most amount of information from people, you're not able to do that. So what he's saying is that it's very expensive for people to conduct these diet histories.
Absolutely. One thing that I absolutely love, is a bit of a tangent, is, I just have a cup of tea. I'm like, oh, okay. And then me thinking in my mind, the tea is maybe 1 teaspoon of sugar, if that, and maybe a little drizzle of milk. But it might be a scenario of like, I've had a couple of instances in the past where it's been, I have a tea, maybe 3 or 4 teas throughout the day, and it's like 10 teaspoons of sugar, which is like, okay, that's it's a variable. I'm very glad I went down and discussed that one. So back onto topic.
I have the same, except for I'll say I have tea, and they go, oh, yeah, interesting. What tea? Yeah, I just have a whole bottle of the nice tea.
Oh, I didn't even think about that one. Yeah, great point. Yeah, beautiful. So epidemiology and studying that kind of thing is extremely difficult. The actual results that we get from that information can be quite varied. There's often a level of underreporting or overreporting depending on the scenario and the person. It seems to be, if we were to statistically average that out, we may get a relatively accurate-ish response depending on a few different things. I likely think that it would be a bit of underreporting in certain aspects.
So I think what we can do here is we can kind of account for a few things in how we can interpret this research. So Matt's absolutely correct. So firstly, it's expensive in that you've got to get well-trained people to conduct these diet histories, and they've got to do it over and over and over again. So you've got to pay them a lot for a long time in order to get a lot of people's diet histories, essentially. So that's what he's saying, is that it's very expensive and it's just difficult to conduct them in general. The other point that he's saying, which is absolutely fair enough, is that, okay, so this is expensive. We've got well-trained people doing this for a long time. And how accurate is the data we're actually getting at the end of the day? Because we've established, as Matt was saying before, these food frequency questionnaires where everyone's done them. How many times a week do you eat broccoli? Or how many times do you eat fruit? How many times a week do you eat vegetables? How many times a week do you drink milk? We know they're awful. So then, okay, we've got the other option of doing the trained person doing it one each individual person. The question becomes, how accurate is that overall? And that's what Matt was saying before. It seems like overall, probably most people tend to underreport. You're obviously going to have the occasional person who overreports. But really, at the end of the day, and I think, Matt, you would agree with me on this one, we've got two really difficult factors two really big things as to why people would underreport. One being memory. Yeah, they're not doing it on purpose. You just forgot. Yeah, people just subconsciously eat. That's the whole thing of why people say you need to start mindfully eating, because people aren't realizing how much food they're actually eating. And the second one being is that they actually may feel a bit of stigma, or they may feel, especially if you're a person who is overweight or obese, boy, you got some dietitian sitting in front of you who you think's judging you about, oh God, no way I'm going to tell him or her about the Tim Tams I ate yesterday. That's no way. So there could be both intentional and unintentional underreporting going there. And with the fact is we live in a population where people are overweight or obese. So more often than not, people are going to be more inclined to underreport rather than if we lived in a population where people had a BMI of 10. Could be the other way around. If we, for example, if we did the diet histories on anorexic people, Matt, would you say it'd probably be the opposite issue?
I would say so, yeah. Or it would be a scenario of the perception that they eat a lot and the reality isn't necessarily reflective of what's actually going on.
Yep, for sure. So yeah, that's always bring it up. I would say the good thing you'd be able to do, man. I think I'm not sure whether this has been done, but you can get an average amount of how much people underreport by, and then you can just adjust to make it. So for example, if people always underreported by 20% or 10%, you'd always be able to adjust up on average, to make it to understand how much people are actually eating.
Sure thing. That'd be quite interesting to see. I'm not specifically aware of how much people generally underreport, but I think it would be highly dependent on the specific population that you're generally assessing, and on an individual basis may not be the most accurate set of data, but very interesting nonetheless. I suspect it's something similar to maybe a 15% reduction in total calories in terms of underreporting. What would you suspect, Max?
Yeah, I've got no idea, honestly. Yeah, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell you, but yeah, it definitely wouldn't be zero. It's probably not going to be as generally anywhere between 10 and 50% wouldn't surprise me. If people said people underreported up to 50%, I'd be like, yeah, I can see that. Again, very dependent on the population as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Agree with you. So all this sort of stuff, same as BMI. We didn't talk about it enough last week when we were discussing it. These things are extremely on population basis only. The fact is that you can't make any of these judgment calls on an individual person. This is only on average in a large group of people.
Absolutely. Max, I remember when I started my nutrition and dietitian university career, we went through a dietary assessment, a 24-hour diet recall. I genuinely could not recall what I had for breakfast that morning, and I could not recall what I had for dinner, and that's someone who was attempting to study nutrition. I'm probably a little bit of an outlier in this, that I did not care about necessarily what I ate until I started learning about it and understanding it, which is a very interesting thing to think about. But it's very much a scenario of no one's memory is perfect, and we're making assumptions on the amounts all the time. Absolutely.
Especially because this is potentially also what I mean about how you need to be decently trained to actually conduct these. I nearly bet you was probably in the room with you. I can't remember that specific time, but I nearly bet you the person doing that review on you was also a student. And so a very not well poorly trained person essentially, and they weren't asking the right questions. They potentially were being judgmental as well. You potentially felt a bit nervous, and you're like, oh, there's this person sitting across from me. I don't feel comfortable around them. I haven't actually built up any rapport with them yet. This person just gone straight into this diet history without actually establishing any sort of relationship. They're not asking any questions such as, for example, if you ask, what was the first meal you ate for the day, and they don't know, then you can probably hone it down a little bit. Was it breakfast? Was it cereal? Was it toast? Just to kind of help them spark up some memories if they aren't actually remembering anything. So, and that person, I can nearly guarantee that person didn't employ all those steps and those strategies in order to help you remember what you ate.
From my recollection, I'm pretty sure it was straight to the prompted cues being, did you have toast for breakfast this morning? Yeah, what was that Nutri-Grain? And then did you use full cream milk or light milk? And I'm like, yeah. If you ever wanted to do a little experiment in your own personal time, start with the open questions first and lead the conversation. And then if there's any lack of information that's being taken in, always lead towards the closed questions if you suspect that there's potentially underreporting and or an area where we haven't discussed in further detail. We got a little bit sidetracked.
We absolutely did.
I love that we get sidetracked. It's probably the more interesting areas of the podcast and conversations. Back on the topic, to summarize of that entire thing, the evidence that we have for specific dietary interventions and or lifestyle habits and the data that we can produce tends to be a little bit muddy. Everything's a bit gray. We have ideas and influences, and there is evidence supporting certain things and characteristics. Certain government organizations take information from that and apply it to their guidelines and recommendations. And then we can also infer the details from that entire situation as dietitians and health professionals to apply our medical nutrition therapy and practices towards our clients. Overall, a little bit gray.
Yeah.
Nutrition and sorry, please go on, Max.
Keep going. Now keep going.
Nutrition and the influence on health regardless of BMI. I was thinking about this the other day in the shower, as everyone has these thoughts in the shower. Is nutrition by itself the potential cause for the negative health outcomes of an increased BMI? As we know, as BMI increases, our potential for diseases such as diabetes, cancer risk, reduction in muscle mass, our ability to function. So what was that, Max? Hypertension? Heart health, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hypertension as well, yeah.
Which is a high blood pressure for normal people. We don't speak gobbledygook.
Arthritis.
The list goes on. It seems like it's a perpetual list of things that tend to go wrong and increase the rates of disease acquisition almost at an exponential rate, which is quite alarming to me. I was thinking, realistically, how much of this could we attribute to nutrition? Is it just because they don't get enough fiber, or is there something else at play that I'm not aware of personally? I haven't done the research and looked into the specific biomechanical pathways or biochemical pathways that actually potentially are theorized to cause these links, and I'm not entirely sure it exists. For, of course, every type of disease, I'm sure there's some for certain areas, but I'm specifically going to focus on the nutrition side, and we're going to work through this together, Max. Try to find and understand, would there be a potential link for the nutrition aspect just alone to cause the negative health outcome, or is it specifically due to weight?
Yeah, I think really good question. For me, I feel like this is pretty clear and pretty obvious, and I would very much push back, and I bet you there's a lot of research out there on this specific area. I think it really comes down to each disease individually. So we can already establish and we can agree a disease like, let's go type 2 diabetes, or reduce control of blood glucose levels, blood sugar levels. That is, as we established last week when we were speaking about it, or the week before, it was definitely we're definitely in agreement that it's a combination of both the poor nutrition and lack of exercise. Those two things combined. So the nutrition obviously has a massive role, but without the lack of exercise, it isn't going to potentially actually lead to the type 2 diabetes. One thing we probably missed out last week was actually talking about genetics as well. There's going to be some people who are much more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, just have a high proclivity to develop it. It's just the reality of being a human being with genetics. That just happens. So I guess my point being, for every single disease state, nutrition would influence it to greater and lesser degrees depending on everything. So if we're looking at let's continue with the type 2 diabetes. The nutrition is going to be a significant portion. The exercise amount is going to be a significant portion. Obviously, the stress and the other elements are going to be a significant portion, but it's all going to be the distribution, just like how our bodies distribute in different ways into fat, muscle, organs, blood, etc. And everyone has different distributions. For every single disease state, there's going to be different distributions as to how much nutrition and exercise and stress is going to impact your likelihood to develop them. Does that make sense?
Isn't it going to be so amazing in 20 years' time where we don't have to have these kind of conversations and we know definitively that the answer is XYZ distribution for each person based on their genetic makeup and their current body composition? I welcome my AI overlords. The more and more we talk about this, I think Dr. Mike Israel did a recent podcast with the other Dr. Mike, and it was a very interesting conversation between them, both of the influence on AI and the medical field in general. I tend to think that I came up with the idea first, and I was the first original OG commenter. But look, it's long past that point. Jumping back onto the topic of distributions and potential for influence depending on the scenario. Yeah, I completely agree, Max. The distribution, that the potential influence that one aspect of health has on a situation is completely dependent upon the disease state itself. Speaking of disease states, let's run through common nutrition deficiencies and their potential health outcomes. For people who aren't aware, a deficiency is when you're not getting enough of a certain nutrient that generally results in a dysfunction in the body that is not favorable for health.
Sure. So do you think So just quickly touching on things. So we'll just rewind just a touch. So because you were talking about how you weren't sure with like a bunch of different of these disease states. Would it be fair, like about what I just said about them being different with the like the key ones, cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, etc., is all nutrition is gonna play a varying role in all of these things as to whether someone is to develop these disease states or not.
Absolutely, Max. And I'd love to discuss further with you, because I think that's such an interesting conversation to have, and to discuss whether and what a dietitian's perspective is on the results of certain dietary lifestyles and conditions that can occur.
Yeah, because I guess nutrition, we've got so many different variables, at play, that, and it is just going to be dependent on how much nutrition does impact it. And it's kind of like you need to get up a step ladder almost, in that if no, it's a bad example. Like I was just going to say, like, once you've ticked a bunch of different boxes, that's when you usually get the disease.
Well, so you're not entirely wrong. Wrong.
It's like, do you have the genetic? Firstly, the first step is always, do you have the genetic proclivity to actually develop the disease in the first place? Because there's going to be some people. I think, isn't that the whole thing with smoking and lung cancer? And that there's just some people have ridiculously low chance of actually getting lung cancer in general. So if they smoke, obviously all the negative health impacts that come from smoking are still existent, but the actual chance of getting lung cancer as per se is very low. I'm pretty sure that's actually true.
I'm not familiar in the slightest. My understanding was that any exposure to toxins and or chemicals that are not positive for the body and introducing free radicals and or inflammation to systemic organs generally results in worse health outcomes overall, regardless of what your genetic factor is. But then again, look, that might be a small subset of the population who just have a natural ability to fight and negate the impacts of certain cancers.
No, it'd still be for all, like, bunch of other cancers and bunch of other disease states, but I think there obviously are people that have, there's good, like, you as an individual probably have an insanely low risk of developing one sort of disease, if that makes sense. And there would be people out there would have an insanely low risk of developing lung cancer. So, like, they're not going to really get that from smoking, if that makes sense. Obviously, they're still going to incur all the thousands of other things, negative things that come from smoking. But you kind of do need that step ladder, right? If you tick off the genetic thing, and that I personally are gonna have difficult times with my heart genetics and heart health moving, like, in the distant future. So, like, that's already ticked off for me, right? And then if I do things like eat, have poor cholesterol levels, so, with my nutrition, and then do things like also be physically inactive, and then have high stress, then I'm kind of going up the step ladder. Poor sleep, I'm overweight or obese. I've got a lot of things where my heart is working super hard, and things aren't going well for my heart health. So I'm kind of just slowly eking my way up the step ladder to get to my beautiful goal. And yeah, I guess that's the way you could look at it, is that you need to tick off the list, and the less amount of times you're letting nutrition, which is one of the variables you can control, genetics not being one of the variables you can control, the less times you're probably going to incur that disease state.
I like to think of these tick boxes as more of a factor of a multiplication. Stress alone probably not going to be the reason that you kick the bucket, of course, unless your stress is so out of control that it is that much of a factor.
If you same as nutrition alone, right?
Well, I guess absolutely.
That's your point.
Absolutely.
That's your point. That's a multiplication point, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the factors combined, you have really high stress, really poor sleep. Shit, man, that's a recipe for disaster. Like, I look at you and I think, heart attack waiting to happen. You multiply that with poor cholesterol markers, potentially hypertension. I think we need to have a conversation and work out what your goals are. Do you want to make it to next year? Yeah, a bit of an exaggeration from my part, but we're actually looking at the scenario. It's how many years do you realistically want to live?
Yeah.
And it's a very grim conversation.
It is a multiplication thing. I really think that's really, really well said. In that, it is every time you've got these things, and that's why the genetics is such a big one, because you start off with a big number, right? You've
or tiny number
on the head. Exactly. The genetics is the number you start off with, and then every time you add something onto that, you're just timesing it until you reach that threshold magical number of 412. All right. Let's go through. I think that was actually pretty well covered. Let's go through to your next topic.
Okay, so we're going through common nutrient deficiencies, because I think that there seems to be information out there. People understand nutrition seems to be a little bit important, and it can be a thing that can occur, but we actually have specific diseases that occur from nutritional deficiency as well as toxicity. We'll focus on deficiency for now, because that tends to be more common from a in quotations, natural perspective. Toxicity usually only occurs from a supplemental perspective, or if you're eating a ton of organ meats or something similar to that. Starting off with nutrition deficiency of vitamin D. Vitamin D we generally get from sun in general. It's not necessarily something that we eat a lot of. We get it through a little bit through eggs, a little bit through cod liver oil and things along those lines. Fish oils tend to have a little bit, some organ meats, something similar. But generally we get a lot of most of our vitamin D from sun exposure. If we don't get enough, and there is a potential for a few of the members of the population to actually get this, especially if you're darker skin complexion, we can develop really poor bone health, as the calcium cannot make its way and store into the bones, and even potentially develop rickets, which is an inability to form the bones correctly. B12, vitamin B12 generally comes from animal sources.
Before we head off, just going to add in a really cool little thing. I love this. You can put your mushrooms in the sun. The mushrooms do some funky stuff chemically, and then if you eat those mushrooms, you can put them in the sun for like 30 minutes or something like that. If you eat those mushrooms, that's actually a really good source of vitamin D as well.
Absolutely. If you're not looking to go a supplementation route, I think that's probably a route that you can do. Not that I think there's anything wrong with the supplementation of it, but it's a very cool thing regardless.
Yeah, I think both Matt and I have B12. I have vitamin D every day. I have 1,000 IUs of vitamin D every day. Do you as well, Matt?
I've actually bumped it to 2,000. So my blood test reports, and I measured before and after. Before it was of a level where I was, okay, look, I'm a bit deficient. It's probably not the best. Let's address that. I'll see if I can get more sunlight. Got another blood test report. Didn't necessarily work. Supplemented with 1,000 IU. Moved up a little bit. Still relatively low for what I would think would be positive in terms of total health outcomes. Added another 1,000 IU, which is about 25 micrograms. Another 1,000 IU. And currently at 2,000, I'm relatively happy with where my vitamin D levels sit on a blood test report, and it's consistent since introducing that, and that's a daily basis, and pretty much stays consistent through winter as well, which is an interesting thing to discuss. Very common in terms of deficiency for a lot of people in the population, especially us, let's say, hard workers who tend to spend a lot of time indoors. Windows closed and or in cubicle offices. Imagine every healthcare worker is pretty much stuck in either their office or in a hospital ward with very minimal sunlight unless they're in the patient's room. Very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Jump over to B12?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, I guess the point being is that both of us are taking it. Doesn't mean that you should be as well. Doesn't mean you need to be. But what it does mean is that vitamin D is one of those, we don't have many that are out there. But vitamin D is one of those vitamins that most people say, and it's like the general consensus is at this point in time, and that, man, like if you take a blood test and it says you could do with it, just do it. Like it's going to be pretty hard to overdose or get to a toxicity level for vitamin D. So just have a small amount, have a regulation amount of, Matt and I are having between 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day. Don't go crazy overloading to 100,000 IUs a day, and you'll be fine.
I have seen reports of potentially additional, let's say, calcification of certain things in the body that shouldn't be calcified, which for people listening, calcification means the addition of calcium to a structure in the body from something as minimal as 5,000 IUs, which is quite interesting to me. I generally think it only happens at 10,000 and above, but if you have the genetic predisposition for the calcification of certain factors, it tends to be that kind of kick over that can increase that rate and kind of negate the positive benefits that we have from vitamin D. So of course, as with all things, the balance is the key. Finding something that works for you and measuring if it's actually having an effect on your vitamin D levels in your blood test reports, or if it's just you're intaking a shit ton just because of the sake of it, or you think you're built different. Sorry to break it to you, you're not that guy. B12. So B12 deficiency, B12 usually comes from your animal sources, specifically red meats, generally tends to be the best source from my awareness. Can be quite common deficiency in vegetarians. B12 is a major factor in producing red blood cells and energy production overall, generally results in anemia, which is the inability for our body to produce red blood cells, constant fatigue, inability to function normally in terms of your lung capacity and or ability to process air. Generally not a thing that I would recommend for most people. It can also result in calcium and bone health reduction. Calcium to bone health reduction, which is a separate option in 2 seconds.
Super important. Yeah, B12 is super important one, and not available in, not an option for vegans to have B12. I think there is one food that actually has B12 in it, I believe. I can't remember off the top of my head. But essentially, yeah, if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, honestly, as well, you're going to have some sort of B12 supplement. From my understanding, they're really easy to have. You can just get drops, put them on the bottom of your tongue, and that's all. That's all you need to do. They're really easy to get done. Also, something lots of older people tend to need B12 supplementation as well, and to help, just because the way the B12 works actually struggles to be absorbed as you get older. But we don't need to go into the actual details as to why that happens.
It's a very interesting mechanism. Maybe we can talk about that in a different podcast for aging gracefully.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it is cool. But yeah, B12 is obviously super important. Focus on, if you're just someone that eats an omnivorous diet, just focus on having, obviously not going too crazy with the red meat, but having enough red meat so that it'll give you plenty of B12.
Absolutely. Next comment was calcium and bone health. We all know that bones are pretty much made majority out of calcium as a key nutrient that we need for their structure and function. A reduction in calcium generally reduces the bone health, may lead to osteoporosis, things along those lines. I can speak from my perspective, not something that you want, as with pretty much all of these deficiencies.
Yeah, I can do. I'm going to be doing a little Instagram post, I think in 2 weeks or so. I think it's scheduled for around 2 weeks from today-ish, on calcium, the importance of calcium for bodybuilders. So protein actually inhibits the absorption of calcium. So what that means is that when you're having a lot of protein in your diet, your ability to absorb calcium is significantly reduced. The degree to that isn't crazy, to be fair. It's not like you're unable to absorb any calcium, but it is something to be aware of as bodybuilders, people trying to gain muscle. You're obviously having a lot more protein than the average person, which means that overall your calcium level, you probably need to have a little bit more calcium just to counteract that reduction in your ability to absorb the calcium overall.
Very interesting.
I just sort of discussed that, probably having a bowl of yogurt every day, which is obviously a good source of protein, can also be a really good source of calcium as well to help you with that. So, that thing in your protein shakes could potentially, instead of having them with water, change them out with milk. Probably make it taste better anyway. another source of calcium that can go in there. So there's a few different things that I'll go over as to how you can increase your calcium. Actually, no, it will be coming out. I would have already done that Instagram post.
Beautiful. Well, make sure to check that one out. That's a very interesting one. I personally cannot stand the taste of protein powder without some kind of milky based.
Yeah, interesting. I don't mind either way. Yeah, but it's just something to focus on, that, for people who are, if you probably want strong bones if you're going to be lifting really heavy weights, and also not wanting to break bones either, or fracture your bones. So focusing on having strong bones is super important.
Quite common in runners of a variety of sports. Stress fractures tend to be quite common, ensuring that we're getting enough calcium, vitamin D, and or additional nutrients to support that bone health. Really important. But generally, I don't think it's too common with bodybuilders. Just from a total load perspective, no. We're putting that progressive load on the bones, which is quite inducive of really good calcium deposition into our bones.
Also, it's also so many different things as to why they're getting the stretch factors. The amount of time that they're running, there's like their total like volume is just insurmountable compared to those doing resistance training.
Absolutely. The application of load as well tends to be quite the shocking impact of running. We can talk about these topics for ages. This is almost an entire podcast series worth of information. We haven't even gone through half a list of deficiencies I wanted to get through, but we'll try to do it relatively quickly. So iron, quite the common deficiency. A lot of women who are between the ages of like 14 to 40 tend to be deficient in iron. Very common, very interesting in the way that we actually manage it. Tends to be a bit, let's say, not as well managed as I would like in a lot of instances. Results in disruption in the ability for our body to produce enough red blood cells because of the iron group, the heme group inside of the red blood cell being not able to come along. Wouldn't recommend anemia. I've heard it's not fun. Any comments for that, Max? We're going to move on to vitamin A.
Look, iron's really tricky. Iron's one of those ones where I think for a lot of women, they have a lot of difficulty on it. And I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of women also that no matter how much iron they eat, they're just unable to absorb the amount that they need, just due to them being women that have menstrual cycles. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot of women that just require to have the infusions as part of their regular life to make them not anemic anymore.
Absolutely.
But yeah, for men, it's obviously so much simpler in that we need so much less iron. That if also men probably tend to eat more red meat anyway, funnily enough. So it really doesn't seem to be much of an issue for men. But yeah, for women, it's massive. And the good thing is there's so many different ways to increase the absorption you have of your iron. Obviously, just eating animal sources of iron is going to be the way to go. But if you're someone who doesn't want to be doing that, you can really go down the rabbit hole. I really encourage you to go down the rabbit hole of looking at ways to increase the absorption of your non-animal sources of iron, because it can definitely make a big difference to how your anemia is going to be handled.
Absolutely. That's a very in-depth cast worth of talking about. Off the top of my mind, I've got making sure you're pairing it with a vitamin C source, not pairing it with calcium to impair absorption, ensuring that you're eating it or eating multiple sources spread throughout. When you're having plant sources, pair it with animal sources. There's a few things that go into how I would personally manage an iron deficiency perspective. Yeah,
I think there's alcohol, I believe, is a thing you don't want to pair it with, I'm pretty sure. But then I remember there's something being about like red wine having the opposite effect or something wacky like that. I don't know, but it's been a while since I've looked at it, a few years at least.
Yeah, I tend to think that if we're factoring in red wine as a major part of our diet, we need to establish exactly what our priorities are in that situation, whether it's ensuring that we're moving in the correct direction. Not to say that you can't have red wine, because you absolutely can, but it's more so about realistically looking at what's inhibiting and what's the realistic scenario of managing that situation.
Practical applications. Yeah, 100%.
Of course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We don't want to be going, I'm going to have some spinach now. Let me pull out the red wine.
Sprinkle a little bit of spinach on top. Yeah, beauty.
So I think calcium may have been wrong. We'll go. We might.
Ooh, I was quite confident on that one. We'll have a chat about it after. Yeah. So calcium impedes iron absorption from my.
Yeah. I think that might be wrong. But anyway, could be. Okay. I could be way off. It's been definitely over 3 years since I've looked at it. So who knows what? Who knows?
Good to know. We'll jump into vitamin A. So vitamin A, retinol equivalents, things along those lines. Generally, people think of vitamin A for eye health. Very important for skin health as well. If you don't get enough vitamin A, it can result in, and please bear with me, I can't pronounce this, xerophthalmia. Eye dysfunction and inability for our eyes to operate normally. They are key in our structure and formation of rods and cones, I believe. And if you have vitamin A deficiency for an extended period of time, the damage that produces cannot be repaired. So ensuring that you're maintaining your vitamin A intake, which is quite difficult to do, I might add, is really important to avoid any long-term eye degradation or visual capacity for that long run, as well as overall, from my awareness, it's quite good for acne I think. There's a few different areas where I'm not familiar with the applications of vitamin A in terms of overall health. I'm pretty sure it plays a role in immune function as well. A lot of these nutrients tend to have overlapping areas, which is quite an interesting topic. Any comments, Max, before we move on to iodine?
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I'd push back on is I'm pretty sure vitamin A is pretty easy to get in. I don't know. I always do when I write my meal plans up every time I create a new meal plan for myself. I always put it through. We have a software that once you put in the food, it tells you exactly how many nutrients, obviously macros, but then obviously all the micronutrients as well. So I put it through that to see what area I might be deficient in, and vitamin A is never one of them. So I don't know, maybe because I love peas, carrots, and corn, which obviously has lots of carrot in it, which is going to give me a lot of vitamin A. But I don't know if I've never struggled with it personally.
But, I think if you have a relatively restricted food pool that you can choose from, and you aren't inclined to choose foods that are high in carotenoids and or orange/red foods, it tends to be quite difficult. And I feel like that if you are of the restrictive nature where you aren't intaking those foods, it's very easy to not have much vitamin A because it tends to be very much in high concentration in some foods and basically nothing everywhere else.
Yeah, I get your point. It is easy to miss out on it. Yeah. I totally understand what you mean by that one. I think for me, the big thing is that just because for me, it feels like it's in so many foods. So it's like, how are you missing out on this? I guess maybe because it's just different diets, but I had a lot of carrots, a lot of sweet potatoes, a lot of pumpkins, a lot of capsicums. So is it in capsicum?
From my awareness, I thought it was. Testing my knowledge here, Max. I'd have to research that afterwards.
I don't know, yeah. But yeah, I have a lot of these foods, so I guess that's not a lot, but they're frequent. They're frequently in. So yeah, I guess that's your point in that if you happen to not like carrots, sweet potatoes, pumpkins, orange, as you're saying, like those orangey vegetables, it's going to be difficult.
Absolutely. Jumping to iodine. Iodine's the forgotten hero of our government interventions. The reason why we recommend, if you were to use salt, we recommend iodized salt because iodine is usually a problem in countries that don't have it in the soil. So when we're growing food in Australia, which is where this is being filmed, the problem with Australian soil is it's relatively low in iodine concentration. And we were noticing in the population, this is I think a fair few years ago, maybe 60 years ago now, we were noticing that people were just having these strange dysfunctions from thyroid-related conditions, whether it be hypothyroidism or goiter or something similar. The iodine itself tends to be quite important in actually producing our thyroid hormones. And without them, it can play a whole havoc on our health as a whole and be one of the only things that actually really influences our metabolic rate, which is quite interesting. Not something that we can actually adjust through pharmaceuticals in terms of providing an aspect to adjust the metabolic rate without impacting health in a negative manner, but something that we need to manage and ensure that it's relatively consistent and correct in terms of how our body functions on a daily basis.
Absolutely, yeah. So with iodine, it's going to be, again, in Australia, we're pretty limited. But the good thing is that the legislation has been pretty proactive about that. So as you said, there's iodized table salt. Big thing is that if you're someone that has bread every day, you're never going to need to worry about iodine at all. The reason being, and also cereals as well.
I think so, yeah. Cereals and bread off the top of my memory.
Yeah, cool. I definitely know bread. I'm not so sure about cereals. I'm pretty sure though. But yeah, either of those things. So pretty much if you're a person who has a regular breakfast, which to be funnily enough, we actually tend to almost advocate against. Nonetheless,
it's quite interesting, isn't it? Well, actually, Max, any product that's produced by a company has to use iodized salt if they put salt in their food in Australia.
Far out.
Yeah, so that's as far as the extent of the government intervention goes. And I thought personally it was a great intervention because it pretty much removed that disease from the population.
Yeah. So, like, does that even include like chips, like salt?
As far as I'm aware, it does. Yeah.
Wow. Shit. That's crazy. I did not know about that. But yeah, point being is that assuming what Matt said is 100% true, if you're basically having any packaged product, because let's be honest, any packaged product has a shit ton of salt in it. which also means that if you're having any packaged product, which, boy, if you're not, you probably, firstly, if you're not, you know that you're not, because you're working really hard to not have any packaged products. And secondly, you're probably so health conscious that you're doing something about it anyway. So I feel like the good thing about iodine, it's at a point where it's like, you don't need to think about it. Either just a regular person who eats a decent amount of packaged food as well as a decent amount of whole foods, and you're getting plenty of iodine in it that way, or you're not, and you have heaps and heaps of whole foods, and you're at a point where you're like, I know that much about nutrition that I could become a banana. That's the plan. So yeah, I feel like it's not applicable to anyone really at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Jumping over to vitamin C, you may have heard of pirates getting scurvy. Scurvy is not necessarily a thing that we see nowadays. Usually it's from a complete deficiency in vitamin C, commonly found in your citrus-y kind of foods. Also a really great source I absolutely love, strawberries. Super high in vitamin C, capsicum's really good as well. Sprinkle of lemon juice on your steak, in my opinion. Or lemon juice on your butter herb chicken. Whew, what a combo. Absolute nutrition powerhouse, and it's delicious. Generally not something that we need to worry about. If you do not intake any, like you said, you're saying on a carnivore diet, we've noticed that vitamin C is a key role in energy production and the breakdown and usage of carbohydrates. It seems that our vitamin C requirements are quite low if the carbohydrate intake is quite low. Not that I would necessarily recommend that, but it's something interesting to note.
Yeah, definitely. I think the interesting thing I've found about vitamin C is that as long as you're having, I don't know if this is too much of a crazy thing to talk about on a public platform, but what I always say individually to people is that as long as you're having enough fruits and vegetables throughout the day, like the recommended amount, you don't need to worry about specifically going out to get vitamin C. So unlike, for example, the vitamin A, where it's like you could be having a bunch of apples, a bunch of bananas, a bunch of cucumbers, any vegetables that exist really outside of those ones high in vitamin A, and you still might need to specifically seek out vitamin A to be able to get that. But what, in my opinion, what I believe is that, and what I've found is that as long as you're having a bunch of fruits and vegetables every day, you don't need to go out to seek that vitamin C just because it's so well found across such a wide range of fruits and vegetables, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that one, Max. I think that's a very interesting and not necessarily known perspective. Vitamin C and scurvy deficiency rates in the modern Western world are relatively low. It tends to be very uncommon for, I wouldn't say very, but it's quite uncommon for those deficiencies to occur. Whether any of these are potentially suboptimal, that's a whole nother ball game, and that's probably worth discussing on the individual client and their symptom management and or suspected relationship with food.
Yeah. So yes, exactly. Definitely the two things we've got. Deficiency versus suboptimal is for vitamin C, I think is a very, very wide range, whereas compared to other things, for example, like you can be the deficiency for suboptimal for other nutrients, it's going to be suboptimal, and then you quickly get deficient. Whereas I feel like vitamin C, you're just suboptimal, you can sit there for quite a long time until you actually get to a point where you're deficient and experiencing issues with that.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm not entirely sure if I have an opinion on that, but I tend to agree that it tends to be quite the range depending on the nutrient. Jumping over to vitamin K, really important for clotting factors and in your blood, specifically referring to K1 in this instance and their forms. If you don't have clotting factors in your blood, if you get a nick on your finger, tends to bleed for a very long time, if not for an extended time, where it will result in, let's say, a not so favorable experience to the emergency room. Anything to do with that, we don't think commonly of bleeding in terms of internally. We actually do bleed internally, and that's generally a result of, or what we can see in terms of bruising. When we bleed internally in other locations, so let's say you have a bleed inside your gastrointestinal symptom, we can experience things like darker stools, and it can occur over an extended period of time to the point where we can become iron deficient or potentially really low in our total blood volume, where it's not necessarily known by a lot of people that we can actually bleed through there. And it's a very common way for, let's say, things to not go so favorably favorably and lets it until it's looked at like the last minute in your emergency room, and the doctor's like, hey, what's going on down there? We might have to do a scope and actually see if there's a problem or not. So we can bleed in multiple different locations, not just externally. Just because the blood's in your body doesn't mean it's in the right spot.
I love blood being in the wrong spot.
It's my favorite thing, Max. It's my absolute favorite thing. Often blood goes to my head when I stand upside down, and it's the closest thing to a drug-induced high that I'll ever experience.
Usually when I do that, I actually feel like more than 2 neurons firing. It's such a good feeling. It feels like to have like what it feels like to have a like IQ of like 70 or so. It's really good. It's IQ booster for me.
I like to think that I have a V12. It's just that one cylinder is pushing everything else to keep moving, and it's only that one cylinder that's getting that spark and moving along. So I have the capacity. I just need to be, what's that movie, Lucy or something, and use 100% of my brain. By the way, that's completely defunct. That's not how brains work. We actually use like a good chunk of it. It's not like 30%.
I think it's 100%.
Pretty sure it's very close to 100%. Not potentially all the time, but a very large majority of the time active, or at least alive. Look, if you were the motor cortex.
I
thought you were pointing to your motor cortex.
The only exception to that rule is me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Max, we've forgotten to acknowledge in this situation, you are built different.
I am that guy.
So Mr. Gosling, let's jump over to vitamin B9, also known as folate. Cool. This has a major factor and is quite common in terms of deficiency in pregnant and, let's say, delivering mothers. We often think of folate as the neural tube defect nutrient. It plays a whole lot more of a factor in terms of our ability to make sure that our DNA is not being perpetually damaged and we can repair any damage that does occur. People don't realize that our DNA gets damaged all the time just by existing, whether it's from radiation exposure, from literally any source of ionizing or not radiation. Preferably ionizing tends to have the more DNA damage, but anything like damage the actual cells. So if you nick yourself, tends to be a form of DNA damage. If there's a chronic inflammation level, form of DNA damage. If there's type 2 diabetes present and producing negative health outcomes, also type 2 also DNA damage. Ensuring that we have adequate B9 also helps negate the negative health outcomes towards our DNA damage. And if our DNA gets damaged too much, it can lead to things like cancer, which is generally not that cool. Any comments on that, Max?
Yeah, folate's a big one, obviously. That very important for pregnancies, as you said, and the opposite of vitamin A, really, in that the vitamin A is you really want to reduce the vitamin A intake throughout the pregnancy. I don't think specifically aim to reduce it, but just it's the
avoid supplementation.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So big one. Well covered for folate.
Yeah, I personally think that it's quite difficult to get unless you're eating a lot of leafy greens. That tends to be, from my awareness, one of the better sources, and I would absolutely recommend a folate supplement or specific pregnancy supplement during your period of your pregnancy. I personally took 3 B9 supplements during my pregnancy, and I'm A-okay. Max, that covers majority of the base.
Was that your first one or your second one?
23rd. That covers majority of the base diseases that I wanted to talk about with nutrition deficiency. I think we've gone way over time to what we expected. Did we want to continue on in terms of potential cancer risk and theories, or are we leaving that for another cast?
Well, I don't really have much to say on that one. I've got a little bit, but not much at all. The last thing I'll just touch on will be one that you may have missed. Biotin. Is biotin B8?
You're testing my knowledge. I thought it was...
So, as Matt's searching it up, so essentially, I'm pretty sure it's biotin. This is really stretching memories. This goes back a long way now.
B7.
B7, right. Okay. I'm going to say it. I don't know exactly which B vitamin it is. When we have a really, really cool fact, no one knows this, and I'm going to be doing an Instagram post on it. This will be done soon. Will be when you have a lot of raw eggs. Not really the hype anymore. Used to be hyped. I don't know why. I guess people thought they were really tough. But if you have a lot of raw eggs, one of the somethings in the eggs, I'm gonna be searching it up soon, actually impacts your ability to absorb biotin, which I'm pretty sure is vitamin B7. And yeah, just good to know. And that if you're someone who thinks you're hardcore, you're like, yeah, man, I have heaps of raw eggs, bro. Look how tough I am. Could be good to just acknowledge that, hey, it's probably not a good thing because it impacts your ability to absorb a key nutrient that your body needs and could potentially become deficient in it. So anyway, just thought I'd put it out there since we're talking about different vitamins. I love that fact because no one knows it. I would say the percentage of dietitians that would actually know that as a fact would be extremely small.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
very interesting.
It's also an accumulation thing, right? Like you don't need to be scared of having, if you're cooked, you fry up your eggs and it was a little bit, your egg white was a little bit runny. It's like, oh, now you're gonna die. It's obviously an accumulation thing. Like if you're having multiple raw eggs every day for a long time, that's when there's gonna be issues.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think Google's given me the wrong answer, Max. I think now I'm getting confused. Apparently B7 and B8 is both biotin. I think I need to go and research my B vitamins more.
So yeah, look, I won't spend too long on the cancer thing, but I think what we'll do, let's talk about it in a future cast. Matthew?
Absolutely, Max. Absolutely. An interesting conversation nonetheless. I think just to create a little teaser, I think that some of the aspects of cancer and nutrition tend to be overplayed, but that doesn't mean that it has no influence. I think it absolutely has a major influence, but potentially not to what some people are saying, specifically referring to online influencers.
Okay, let's just explore that a little bit. So can you say what you said just in a different way? Is that okay?
Yeah. I find that online influencers will be quite confident in prescribing high dose, either magnesium or B9 or something similar, and may or may not have potential affiliations with supplement companies, and state that there is sufficient evidence to support a reduction in cancer risk. I believe that there is with avoiding deficiency, but I'm not entirely sure if it's the nutrient in isolation from a supplemental form or if it's the nutrient in combination with their sources, which I think is a very key difference between the two. Just because you're getting the nutrient doesn't mean you're receiving the benefit that we're observing in studies.
Really well said. Really well said. Yeah. I can't really push back too much on that. I didn't think that's what you were talking about. When you told me this is what we're going to be talking about today, I was under the impression we're going to be talking about, can we isolate nutrition for the disease, like for the cancer risk? So like, could we say, can we take away all the other variables and just figure out how much is nutrition impacting someone's ability to develop cancer?
That was where I was going with the conversation. Then I realized we got to the 58-minute mark, and I think we should leave it for a part 2 because I think that will be quite interesting to explore.
Part 2 sounds good. Thanks for listening, guys.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
See ya.